Okay, so I've owned the Fujifilm X-H2s for more than a year now, and in this video I want to talk about what's good, what's bad, and is it still worth buying. So first thing, let's knock out all the basic specs of the Fujifilm X-H2s. So it has the X-Trans 5 Pro sensor, which is a stacked 26 megapixel sensor. The files coming out of this sensor are really great, both in photo and video, and I'm extremely happy with them. Also, the sensor readout speed is great. Shooting with electronic shutter, you don't get much distortion, bowing, or any artifacts that other cameras without a stacked sensor would have. The ISO range on the camera is 160 to 12,800, and it is also expandable, but I wouldn't go past 12,800. Ideally, I don't like going past 6,400, but I have shot up to 12,800 and still managed to have usable photos for client shoots and stuff like that. It's definitely behind other cameras from different brands, but it's still good enough for what it is. I shot parties, festivals, events at night with limited light, and I still had great images and great videos, so it's not a deal breaker. The camera is fully sealed, which being a flagship, it has to be so. It's water resistant and dust resistant. I wouldn't go plunging it into the water, but if you're out in rain, snow, windy conditions, I don't know, at the beach with a lot of sand, you will be fine. Granted, you also need to have a weather sealed lens on it to make it weather sealed, but if you have a weather sealed lens on this camera, it's basically bomb proof, and I would trust it with anything. The build quality is great. It's all magnesium body or something. Generally, it's great. The buttons feel amazing. It's really nice to use, to look at, to hold. So that's another big plus for the camera. Fujifilm has had a lot of issues with their firmware, and the firmware I have on my camera is firmware 1.03. Currently, firmware 7.00 is out, and it's kind of a hot mess. The autofocus is not great, and that's mainly the issues with the firmware. So if you're watching this in the future, hopefully Fujifilm has fixed all the issues with new firmware. If you're watching this right now when firmware 7.00 is out, I'm talking from a perspective of firmware 1.03. So just keep that in mind when I talk about autofocus and stuff like that. If you shoot a lot of sports, the Olympics are going on right now. This camera shoots 15 frames per second with the mechanical shutter and 40 frames per second with the electronic shutter. I have never used the 40 frames per second shutter ever since owning this camera. I tried it today for the first time just to make sure it can do it, and it can. I used the 15 frames per second burst maybe 2 or 3 times while shooting BMX, and basically that's it. So I generally keep it at either 5 or 8 frames per second when I'm shooting weddings and stuff like that, which is more than enough for me. I don't want to come home with a million files. I already tend to overshoot, so not using a high shutter speed is better for me. But if you need high shutter speeds, this thing can deliver. It also has pre-shooting if that's important to you. You can pre-shoot up to, I think, 110 photos. So this means when you half press the shutter, the camera is already buffering and shooting photos, and when you press it completely, it will save up to 120 photos from before you started your burst. This will also give you a ton of files, but it might come in really handy when you're shooting sports and stuff like that. Again, not something that I ever need using. The RAW files coming out of this camera are great. I really like editing Fujifilm RAW files because the colors are really nice. The dynamic range is pretty good. I wouldn't say it's best in class or it's extreme because it's basically the same as my Fujifilm X-T3 and maybe the Fujifilm X-T4. Maybe a little bit worse, but that's because a stacked sensor will usually have worse dynamic range. But honestly, it's nothing that I actually noticed in editing photos, so I would say on par with the X-T3 and X-T4. The camera has IBIS, so if you want to do longer exposures handheld, you can definitely do it. It's supposed to have 7 stops of IBIS, so you can really go quite long, especially if you also have an image stabilized lens. But for me, the IBIS is more important for video, and I'm really happy that it has it. I have to say it's better than the Fujifilm X-T4, but still it's not as good as some other cameras on the market, mainly like the Lumix and Sony cameras. When just holding a stable shot, the IBIS is great, but when you start moving, sometimes it's kind of sticky. It tries to fight you and hold the shot like you were holding it stable, and then just hops in behind you, but at the end of the day it's much better than having no IBIS, and I really don't have many issues with it. Adding stabilization in post will mainly fix most of the issues that you will come across with the IBIS. So yeah, I'm really happy that it has it. It works well enough for me. It's not gimbal levels, but that's also not something I would expect from an IBIS system. Now we come to the video specs, and this is where this camera shines in my opinion. It shoots 4:2 to 10-bit either ProRes or H.265 video. You can also shoot H.264 in 8-bit, but I don't know why someone would do that. So yeah, I keep it in H.265 just to limit the file sizes, because ProRes will eat up storage like it's nothing, and I do more run and gun shooting. Most of my client work is for social media stuff, so I don't really need ProRes. If I was shooting something like an ad that would go on bigger screens, TVs and stuff like that, I would probably try to shoot ProRes just to get the best possible quality. But already with H.265 you can shoot between 50 and 720 megabits per second, which is kind of crazy. Most cameras go to around 100 or maybe 200, but Fujifilm really gave you a lot of options between going as low as 50 and as high as 720 megabits. I usually keep it around 200. That's been more than good enough for me, and I'm really happy with what I get and the file sizes I get with shooting 4K 60 or 24 frames per second in H.265 at 200 megabits per second. So in 4K the X-H2s can do 24, 30 and 60 frames per second with no crop on the image, and if you want more slow motion it can do 120 frames per second with a 1.29 crop, which is still pretty good in my opinion. I maybe used the 120 frames per second once or twice. I generally don't need it for my work, and I usually stick to 60 and 24. It also gives you the option to shoot open gate 6.2K, which gives you a much taller image, and it's great if you want to shoot stuff and then use it for both horizontal and vertical content, or you just want the high resolution to be able to crop in more into your image and give you different framing options. Anyways, it does it and it's great. Keep in mind that with 6.2K you can't shoot 60, you can only shoot 24 and 30 frames per second. When it comes to colors in video, you can shoot f-log and f-log2. f-log2 is great, and I mainly shoot f-log2 for stuff like this, but the only downfall is the high base ISO of 1250 with f-log, or if you want to call it f-log1, the base ISO is 640, which is much better than the 1250 of f-log2, but f-log2 gives you more flexibility in post, and I like using it more than f-log1. You can also use the Fujifilm film simulations when shooting video. I generally don't do that much, and if I do, I will use a modified classic chrome film simulation, which I'll put on screen right here. And these settings will give you a lot of latitude without having to use f-log and without having to use the base ISO of 640. Since I mentioned film simulations, some people love them, some people really don't care about them. I generally am on the fence, because sometimes when I do road trips and stuff like that, when I'm shooting just for fun, I do use them and I do enjoy them, but that's maybe 10% of the time shooting with the camera, so it's not as important for me. But recently I took a day trip to Tangier, and I had the idea to kind of come up with my own film recipe for the camera, and I'm honestly really happy with what I got out of it. I loved the photos so much that I ended up not even editing the raw files and just keeping the JPEGs, and that's it. So yeah, if you like shooting and would like to not have to edit your photos, just find a film recipe you like, shoot with that, and just keep the JPEGs for yourself and enjoy shooting. Anyways, the X-H2s being the flagship has all the film simulations that Fujifilm gave us, except I am on firmware 1.03, so I don't have the newest one, which is Reala Ace. It is available with firmware 7.00, but I want to keep this firmware just because it's more reliable. Now let's go into the most controversial topic when it comes to Fujifilm cameras, and that's the autofocus. So keep in mind, this is firmware 1.03 that came out in 2022 because the new firmware kind of messed up the autofocus. I do have some videos on the topic of firmware, which will be linked down below. So I would say the autofocus on this camera is reliable enough. It's not perfect, it's not on the level of Sony and Canon and even Lumix and Nikon nowadays, but it is good enough where you can work most jobs without many issues. Eye tracking is quite good if you have only 1 or 2 subjects in the frame. Whenever I have more subjects in the frame, I will just switch it back to zone focus and move the box around to wherever I want to focus on. Continuous autofocus and tracking subjects is decent. Again, not the best in class, but it will work for what you need it to do, and most cases it works fine. Keep in mind that the autofocus is really reliant on contrast, so if you don't have a lot of contrast in your scene, the autofocus will be kind of harder to use than if you had a more contrasty scene. It will also depend quite a bit on the lenses you have. Some lenses perform better, some lenses worse, but generally I would say the autofocus is like a 6.5 out of 10. Not perfect, but good enough to where you can create what you want to create, and good enough where it works kind of well. When it comes to video for talking heads like this one, I don't have any complaints. It works well. When it comes to more difficult situations, sometimes it can be kind of a pain, but generally it's good enough in my opinion, and I didn't have many issues with it. In the past year, I used my X-H2s on about 30 weddings. Most were just photo, some were hybrid photo plus video, and one was only video. I also used it to film about 30 to 40 YouTube videos. I used it on car videos, car photography, food photography, a lot of client shoots, whether it's photo or video, and it's been good for the most part. Sometimes it does freeze where you need to do a hard reset and take the battery out, but I can say since I switched back from firmware 7.00 to firmware 1.03, it hasn't frozen yet, and I've been working with it quite a bit, so hopefully it keeps not freezing, and hopefully Fujifilm fixes all the issues with new firmware, but we'll see about that. A few final things about the camera and the design of the camera. I really like that it doesn't have the vintage Fujifilm dials. It has a more classic look to it. I like that I can see whether I have cards in, whether the battery is charged, even when the camera is off. I love that all the buttons are customizable. The only thing I don't really like is that you can't put ISO on a dial. You need to either press a button and then use the dial to change ISO, but I go around it with assigning the up and down buttons both to ISO, and that way when I need to change the ISO, I can just start pressing down or start pressing up to increase it or decrease it, and that's been working really well for me. I also really like having a CF Express card slot because it decreases the transfer times from my camera to my computer, which is always nice. I hate having to wait for a long time to transfer footage. I always use 512 gigabyte cards because I don't want to have to swap cards during a shoot, and with 512 gigabytes I still haven't had a shoot where I fill it all up, so I'm quite happy with that. Battery life is really good and I have no issues there, and basically that's it. I like the screen, I like the EVF. I generally really like this camera, but is it worth buying nowadays with so many other cameras on the market and with great performing cameras coming really down in price? When I was buying this camera, it was replacing my Fujifilm X-T3, and the important things for me were that it could do both photo and video well, that it could do 4K 60 without a crop, and that it was reliable. And it has been quite reliable except the freezes that I had, but hopefully that's fixed with the old firmware and the downgrade. If you really care about shooting with Fujifilm, this is the camera I would go for, just because it has, in my opinion, the best sensor, the best video performance, the best Fujifilm autofocus performance, and doesn't have the huge 40 megapixel files that the other current Fujifilm cameras have. If you don't care about film simulations, and if you don't specifically want to have a Fujifilm camera, I would probably go for the Nikon Z6ii. In my opinion, it has everything and more of what the Fujifilm X-H2s has. It's also full frame, it's better in low light, so it's generally a better camera for not that much more money, and it's what I'm thinking about replacing my Fujifilm X-H2s in the near future. But still, the X-H2s is still an amazing camera, and especially for video work, I would definitely recommend it. I don't know, do your research and let me know if you choose to go with the X-H2s or replace it with anything else. If you already have an X-H2s or buy one and it's on a newer firmware that still doesn't work perfectly, send me a message on Instagram and I can help you with downgrading your firmware. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.